All right, well, let's take a look at Chapter 5 as we get started here on the American Revolution. Here's the preview. We'll do 4 sections here and one section at a time. And here's the first one. Crisis begins. Focus question there. So take that down and we'll get going. The experience and costs of the Seven Years' War led Great Britain, where King George assumed the throne in 1760, to consolidate its growing empire and make the colonists share in its costs. No one on either side of the Atlantic expected that 2 decades later would bring the separation of the American colonies from the mother country. The Seven Years' War highlighted to rulers in London the importance of the empire to Britain's well-being and status as a great power. They now believed that regulations were needed to protect the continuation of that prosperity. Prior to 1763, Parliament occasionally passed measures to regulate the direction of the colonial economy, and colonists frequently ignored these laws. Regarding the internal affairs of the colonies, the British government seemed uninterested, but the Board of Trade began a more hands-on approach in the late 1740s. It demanded that colonial lawmakers heed royal instructions, but the Seven Years' War dampened the trend. During the Seven Years' War, the British had treated colonists as equals, recognizing their contributions to winning the conflict. After the war, in the mid-1760s, the British returned to viewing colonists as subordinates whose role was to enrich the mother country. Without precedent, British rulers sought imperial reforms to make administration of the American colonies more efficient and systematic, and to raise funds to help pay for the war, which cost Britain far more than its colonies, and finance their empire. To them, it seemed fair to force Americans to follow the Navigation Acts, help reduce the war debt, and pay for continued British protection. Millions of Britons had no representatives in Parliament, but according to the theory of virtual representation, these Britons were constituents of each member of the Parliament, each of whose duty was to represent the whole empire, not simply his district. Americans' argument that they could not be taxed without enjoying direct representation in Parliament did not find much support in Britain. In the early 1760s, British efforts to combat smuggling by issuing general search warrants called writs of assistance and the proclamation of 1763 barring further settlement on lands west of the Appalachian Mountains alarmed many colonists. While the Sugar Act of 1764 actually reduced taxes on French molasses imported from the French West Indies to North America, it also enacted new machinery to combat smuggling. Furthermore, it strengthened admiralty courts where smugglers could be judged without the benefit of a trial by jury, countering colonial assemblies' tendencies to acquit tax evaders. Colonists ignored the reduction in tax rate and viewed the act as an attempt to force payment of a tax they previously would have evaded altogether. A revenue act also enlarged the list of enumerated goods under the Navigation Acts. Together, the measures threatened colonials' profits and seemed likely to exacerbate an already serious economic downturn after the end of the Seven Years' War. The Stamp Act of 1765 represented a change in imperial regulation and a direct tax on the colonies rather than a tax on trade. The Stamp Act required all printed revenue without consultation of colonial assemblies. Previous acts had offended only segments of the colonial population, but the Stamp Act offended a much broader portion of the population, especially those in the public sphere who relied on printed materials and followed political affairs. Additionally, the prospect of a standing British army in the colonies alarmed colonists. The Stamp Act directly challenged colonial elites who controlled revenue and its expenditure through colonial assemblies. These elites defended their authority in the name of liberty. The conflict caused by the Stamp Act was the first great drama of the Revolutionary period. No word was more often used for resistance than liberty. Mock funerals portraying the death of liberty were held, and other symbols of liberty proliferated, such as hangings in effigy of stamp distributors and tax collectors. Open-air meetings were held beneath the Liberty Tree, where stamp distributor Andrew Oliver was hung in effigy, a space that came to be called Liberty Hall. A pine mast erected as a meeting place for Stamp Act opponents was called the Liberty Pole. Even before its passage, a committee of correspondence was formed in Boston to encourage widespread intercolonial opposition to the Sugar and Currency Acts. The action led to similar committees being formed across the colonies for the exchange of ideas and resistance information. Initiated by colonial elites, the resistance to the Stamp Act was similar but much more widespread. Political debate pervaded the colonies and drew in large crowds across class and occupational lines. In cities such as New York and Boston, crowds often organized by the Sons of Liberty destroyed the stamps and forced those administering the law to resign. The coercive activities of the Sons of Liberty, supported mostly by urban artisans, laborers, and sailors, frightened imperial officers in the colonies as well as colonial elites who opposed the Stamp Act but preferred orderly and peaceful protest. Though the Americans' resistance, along with pressure from London merchants and manufacturers afraid of losing American markets, led Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act in 1766, that body simultaneously passed a Declaratory Act, which affirmed that Parliament had the authority and power to pass laws in the future that affected the colonies, including new taxes. The 1760s also saw considerable internal social turmoil within the colonies. In the western backcountry of many colonies, the conflicting land claims of settlers, speculators, colonial governments, and Indians sparked disputes. Rural settlers and farmers had long resented the power and influence of land speculators and large proprietors. In the mid 1760s, a group of wealthy backcountry South Carolina settlers calling themselves regulators protested the underrepresentation of Western settlements in the colony's assembly and the failure to establish local governments that could regularize land titles and impose law and order. In North Carolina, groups of small farmers taking the same name refused to pay taxes, disrupted courts, and attacked local officials and the property of land speculators, merchants, and lawyers. These armed farmers were suppressed only in 1771 by the colony's militia. In the mid 1760s, tenants on the large estates of landowners in New York's Hudson River Valley, calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, stopped paying rent and began to seize land, but they were also suppressed by colonial militia and British troops. Small farmers in Vermont and other parts of New England also took up arms to defend their land claims and resist colonial authorities. Such social turmoil made some colonial elites fear that resistance to British imperial authority threatened their own power and authority over their subordinates within the colonies, and they were more reluctant to challenge the British authority when the next imperial crisis arose. So that's the end of our first section, and we will see you all next time.